The airport terminal was nearly empty, yet a lone figure remained, a German shepherd, its golden brown eyes scanning every traveler with a quiet desperation. A collar glinted under the artificial lights, engraved with a name and a past now abandoned. The hum of the airport was a distant murmur, a blend of hurried conversations and the distant echo of suitcase wheels against polished tile. Among the rush of travelers moving toward their destinations, a single, still figure remained, a German shepherd, its fur damp from the cold night air, its ears twitching with every footstep that passed. The dog sat just beyond the automatic sliding doors, watching as strangers rushed in and out, unaware of the silent guardian left behind. He had once belonged to someone. That much was clear. His coat, though dulled with exhaustion, still bore the luster of careful grooming. A thick leather collar circled his neck, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, its engraved plate reflecting the stark reality of his abandonment. The name etched upon it, Maximus. Passengers glanced at him but kept walking. Airport security murmured among themselves, unsure of what to do. Was he lost? Stray dogs didn't carry collars like that, nor did they sit with such quiet, trained patience, as though still waiting for a command. But Maximus wasn't waiting for just any command. He was waiting for his master. Only hours ago, he had been led through these very halls, his paws gliding over the smooth floors as he stayed close to the towering figure beside him. The scent of cologne, crisp and expensive, clung to the man's tailored suit, Victor Langley, a name that carried weight among the world's wealthiest elite. A self-made millionaire who owned private jets, glass-walled penthouses, and an empire that stretched across continents. And yet, as the boarding gate had closed behind him, Victor had walked away without looking back. Maximus had followed, at first. He had trotted after his master's retreating footsteps, weaving between hurried passengers, his nose catching the scent of familiarity amid the sterile air. But then an unfamiliar hand had caught his leash, pulling him back. A stranger in a security uniform. There had been muffled words exchanged, a final glance from Victor that was brief, almost dismissive. Then the doors had sealed shut, and the man who had once been his whole world was gone. Still, Maximus did not move. Somewhere in his mind, in the quiet place where loyalty resided, he believed that his master would return, that this was some kind of test, a command left unspoken. He had been trained for discipline, for patience. He would wait. The night stretched on. The halls of the airport grew emptier, the hum of human movement fading into silence. A janitor, pushing a mop across the tiled floors, paused to glance at him. A pair of flight attendants whispered among themselves as they exited a late shift, but no one approached, and no one came back for him. The hours dragged into morning. The city beyond the airport flickered awake, its neon veins pulsing with early traffic. But inside these walls, Maximus remained a statue of stillness, his golden brown eyes fixed on the space where his master had last stood. His stomach ached. Hunger had begun to gnaw at him, but he ignored it. His training told him to be still, to obey, to wait, and yet a growing unease stirred in his chest. This was not like the other trips. In the past, Victor had always taken him along. They had flown together in private jets, traveled to sprawling estates with marble floors and gardens that stretched into the horizon. Maximus had been more than a pet, had been a symbol, a fixture in Victor Langley's carefully curated world. People admired him. They praised his discipline, his strength, the sleek lines of his powerful frame. He had been groomed, fed the finest meals, even given his own bed of imported leather and silk. And now, he sat on a cold tile floor, surrounded by indifferent strangers. The first pang of doubt crept into his mind. Had he done something wrong? A gust of wind from the automatic doors brought a sharp scent of rain and asphalt. Maximus lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. The world outside was foreign, unpredictable. Without his master's voice guiding him, without the familiar touch of a hand on his fur, the vastness of it all felt overwhelming. For the first time, he considered moving. A small child walked past him, clutching her mother's hand. She turned to look at him, her wide eyes filled with curiosity rather than fear. "Mommy, look at the doggy," she said, tugging at the woman's sleeve. The mother barely spared a glance. "Come along, sweetie. He's probably waiting for someone." The girl hesitated, her fingers unwrapping from her mother's grasp. She reached into the pocket of her small coat and pulled out a half-eaten granola bar. With careful steps, she approached him, her tiny fingers outstretched. Maximus sniffed the offering but did not take it. He was not allowed to accept food from strangers. His training had been absolute. But the girl only smiled. "It's okay," she whispered. "You look hungry." Her kindness was fleeting. Before he could decide whether to break his rule, her mother called her back, pulling her away into the stream of departing passengers. The food lay forgotten on the ground. Maximus lowered his head again, resting his chin on his paws. The world around him continued to move, but for him, time remained frozen. Victor would come back. He had to. And so, Maximus waited. The airport bustled with life as the morning rush began. Wheels of rolling suitcases rattled across the tiled floors, muffled voices wove through the air, and the scent of coffee drifted from nearby kiosks. But for Maximus, the world remained still. His body ached from the hours of waiting, his muscles stiff from the cold, but he didn't move. His golden brown eyes flickered toward the gates, where he had last seen Victor Langley disappear. The whispers started then. "Whose dog is that?" a man muttered, sipping his coffee. "Must be lost," another said. "Looks too well groomed to be a stray." Maximus didn't acknowledge them. He had learned long ago to filter out unnecessary noise. He was waiting. That was all that mattered. A security guard finally took notice. A heavy-set man with a badge clipped to his belt, he walked toward Maximus with measured steps, pulling out his radio. "Got an unattended dog here near Terminal C. Looks like a German shepherd. No owner in sight." A response crackled through. "Any aggression?" The guard studied Maximus, who barely moved except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. "Negative. Seems well behaved. I'll check for tags." He crouched slightly, extending a cautious hand. "Hey there, buddy," he said, voice gentler now. "Where's your owner?" Maximus turned his head slightly at the voice, his ears flicking back. The man smelled unfamiliar, coated in synthetic scents of polyester and metal. He did not react aggressively, but he did not move either. The guard saw the leather collar and the gold-plated tag. He tilted it toward the light, reading the engraving. "Maximus, property of Victor Langley." The name struck recognition. The guard frowned, pressing the radio again. "The tag says Victor Langley." A pause. Then the voice on the radio replied, "As in the billionaire?" "Yeah, looks like his dog." The guard glanced around the terminal, but there was no sign of an assistant, chauffeur, or handler. Just a lone dog waiting. Think he forgot him? The absurdity of the question made him chuckle, but the possibility hung heavy in the air. He sighed and pressed the radio again. "I'll call Animal Services, see if they can hold on to him until we get word from Langley's people." At the word hold, Maximus finally moved. It was slight a shift of weight, a slow lift of his head, but it was enough to make the guard hesitate. Maximus knew those words. He had been trained in various commands, had heard the clipped voices of estate staff discussing his movements. He understood what it meant to be taken. He did not resist. Not yet. The guard exhaled, giving Maximus one last scratch behind the ears before walking off. "Hang tight, buddy. We'll get you sorted." But Maximus was already planning. He had been trained for discipline, but he had also been trained for freedom. The sun had fully risen when the animal control officer arrived. A woman in a blue uniform stepped out of a van parked near the curb. Her brown eyes were kind, but the leash in her hand spoke of control. She knelt beside Maximus, speaking softly. "Hey boy, you lost?" He did not react. His eyes flicked to the leash, the van, the open door waiting for him. The woman checked his tag, her lips pressing into a thin line. She recognized the name just as the security guard had. "Victor Langley," she muttered under her breath. "No way he lost a dog like you by accident." She glanced around, looking for someone who might claim him, but no one did. With a sigh, she reached for the leash. And Maximus ran. It wasn't a frantic sprint, but a precise, calculated movement. His muscles coiled and released in a practiced rhythm, his paws gliding over the smooth floors as he weaved between startled passengers. The leash clipped the air just inches from his neck before falling uselessly to the ground. The woman cursed, lunging forward, but Maximus was already gone. He didn't run aimlessly. There had been moments, brief flickers of movement, where he had seen what he was looking for. Large glass doors that slid open with the motion of bodies, leading to the world beyond. The scent of rain had wafted through, the damp earth calling to him. If Victor wasn't coming back, then Maximus would find him himself. He heard the shouts behind him, the rush of footsteps giving chase, the echoes of airport security voices cutting through the air. But Maximus had never been meant for cages. With one final push, he darted through the sliding doors and into the open world. The city sprawled before him, vast and unrelenting. Taxis honked, tires splashed through rain-soaked streets, and the smell of gasoline and damp pavement filled his lungs. For a moment, he hesitated, and then he ran. The city was a living, breathing thing, pulsing with movement and noise. It was nothing like the vast estates or private jets Maximus had known. Here, everything was fast, chaotic, unpredictable. Horns blared, voices clashed, and the sharp scent of exhaust fumes filled the damp air. Maximus ran, his paws pounding against the wet pavement. His coat, once pristine, was now speckled with dirt and rain. But none of that mattered. The only thought in his mind was find Victor. The problem was he didn't know where to look. He slowed near a crosswalk, his chest rising and falling with quick breaths. People moved past him in a blur, their faces unreadable, their steps hurried. No one stopped for him. No one noticed the lost dog weaving through their world. For the first time, doubt crept in. Victor had always been there. Always at the other end of the leash. Always the voice that commanded. Always the hand that led him. Now, there was nothing. No scent, no signal, no certainty. A sudden sharp whistle cut through the air. Maximus's ears flicked, his head snapping toward the sound. His heart surged with momentary hope, but it wasn't Victor. It was a man on the sidewalk, calling for a cab. The sharp sound of the whistle had been so familiar, so close to the commands he had known, that his body had reacted before his mind could catch up. The realization sent a deep ache through him. He was alone. And for the first time he understood what that truly meant. The rain started again. Maximus wandered, no longer running, his steps slower, heavier. The hunger he had ignored for hours had grown unbearable, twisting in his stomach like a relentless grip. He stopped near a food cart, the scent of grilled meat wrapping around him like a cruel whisper. A man in a raincoat stood behind the cart, flipping patties on a steaming grill. The scent was overwhelming, making Maximus's mouth water. His training had taught him never to beg, never to take food without permission, but hunger had no rules. Slowly he stepped forward. The vendor noticed him and let out a sharp bark of laughter. "Well, look at you. Fancy pup like you lost out here?" He reached for a paper plate, tossing a small piece of meat onto it before setting it on the ground. "Go on, boy. Looks like you need it more than me." Maximus hesitated, his instincts screamed against it, but his body overruled them. He ate. The taste of warm food after hours of emptiness was almost unbearable, the relief so sharp it nearly hurt. For a brief moment, he forgot that he was lost, forgot that Victor wasn't coming. But the moment didn't last. Because then, he smelled something else. Something familiar. Something impossible. It was faint, barely noticeable beneath the rain and city fumes. But it was there. Victor's scent. Maximus froze, his body rigid, his nose lifting to the air. The smells of the city tangled together in a mess of gasoline, food, and damp concrete butte woven through it, like a single thread in a vast tapestry, was something he knew better than anything. Cologne. Crisp, clean, expensive. The same scent that had clung to his master's suits, the scent that had lingered in every car, every hotel, every place they had ever stayed. Maximus's muscles tensed. He was here. The fatigue vanished. The hunger, the rain, the ache of waiting it, all fell away as instinct took over. His paws moved before his mind could process it, following the invisible path in the air. He weaved through streets, dodging moving cars, slipping between people too preoccupied to notice the streak of gold and black fur passing them. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short bursts. Then he saw it. A luxury hotel, the kind only the wealthiest could afford. The entrance was lined with sleek black cars, their polished surfaces gleaming under the dim city lights. A doorman stood at the front, nodding to well-dressed guests as they entered the lobby. Maximus slowed, his head tilting up. And then, Victor. A flash of a tailored suit, a familiar posture, the unmistakable silhouette of the man he had been searching for. For a moment the world shrank. It was just the two of them. Maximus stepped forward, his body trembling from exhaustion and relief. His tail wagged slightly, uncertain, hopeful. His eyes locked onto the man who had once been his world. He barked, short, sharp, a call. "I found you." Victor turned. For a split second their eyes met. And then, nothing. No recognition, no surprise, no relief. Victor's gaze swept over him without a flicker of emotion. His eyes, once so familiar, so commanding, held only indifference. He turned away, his conversation uninterrupted, stepping into the warmth of the hotel. Maximus barked again, louder this time. Victor didn't look back. The doors slid closed behind him. Maximus stood in the rain, his fur dripping, his body shaking. The realization hit harder than anything else, harder than the hunger, the cold, the exhaustion. Victor hadn't forgotten him. Victor had abandoned him. The last piece of certainty in Maximus's world shattered. For the first time in his life, he did not know what to do. And for the first time in his life, he stopped waiting. The rain poured harder now, soaking Maximus to the skin, his fur clinging to his body in thick, matted clumps. The city pulsed around him, oblivious to his silent suffering. He stood at the curb, frozen, watching the hotel doors where Victor had vanished. The realization settled in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He had found Victor. He had done everything he was trained to follow, seek, wait, and yet it hadn't mattered. Victor had seen him, looked at him, and then, without hesitation, had turned away. Maximus lowered his head, ears flattening against his skull. He had been wrong to wait. Wrong to believe in the unbreakable bond he thought they shared. Because it had already been broken. The city lights blurred in his vision. Whether from the rain or the deep ache inside him, he couldn't tell. He had no master now, no commands to follow. Only an endless, empty street stretching out before him. A gust of cold wind carried the smell of wet pavement and gasoline, rustling through the streets like a whisper of something unknown. Maximus turned away from the hotel, his paws moving before his mind could catch up. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew that he couldn't stay. He wandered for hours. The city was a labyrinth, vast and unfamiliar. Unlike the pristine estates and controlled spaces he had known before, this place had no boundaries, no certainty. The streets were slick with rain. Neon lights flickered against puddles like broken glass, and towering buildings loomed above him like silent giants. Everywhere he went, life continued as if he did not exist. He passed people, their faces hidden beneath umbrellas, their hurried footsteps clicking against the pavement. Some glanced at him, a few with fleeting concern, but none stopped. To them, he was just another stray. A nothing. His stomach twisted with hunger. His body ached from exhaustion, his muscles sore from running. Every so often, his legs trembled beneath him, but he forced himself forward. A scent drifted toward him food. He followed it without thinking, his instincts overriding the last remnants of his discipline. He reached a small food stand at the corner of a busy street, where a man flipped steaming patties on a grill. The smell was intoxicating, overwhelming the gnawing emptiness inside him. He took a cautious step forward. The vendor noticed him and let out a small laugh. "Well, ain't you something? Fancy pup like you out here?" Maximus didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. The man crouching, tearing off a small piece of meat, placing it on a napkin, setting it down. An offering. He hesitated. He had never been allowed to accept food from strangers. It had been one of his earliest lessons, a rule as absolute as obedience itself. But Victor's rules didn't matter anymore. Maximus stepped forward and ate. The warmth of the food spread through his body, dulling the sharp edges of hunger. The man watched him with quiet curiosity. "Poor thing. You got left behind, huh?" Maximus didn't know how to answer that. He licked the last crumbs from the napkin, lifting his gaze, and that's when he smelled it. Something familiar. Something impossible. His ears pricked forward, his body tensing. Beneath the layers of city-scents, gasoline, rain, food, there was a faint trace of something he knew. Victor. It was distant, nearly lost in the wind, but it was there. His muscles coiled with a sudden burst of energy. exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He lifted his nose higher, tracing the scent through the maze of city air, blocking out everything else. His paws moved before his mind could register the decision. He ran. The scent led him through streets he had never seen before. He weaved between moving cars, dodged puddles, slipped through alleyways where shadows stretched like clawed fingers. The world blurred into streaks of neon and rain, but he didn't stop. Not until he saw it. A towering hotel, sleek and pristine, its entrance lined with polished black cars. Wealth and luxury dripped from every surface. It was the kind of place Victor belonged to, world Maximus had once been part of. His heart pounded in his chest. And then there, a familiar shape, a familiar stride. Victor. For the first time since the airport, Maximus felt hope. He stepped forward, his tail lifting slightly. His entire body trembled not from exhaustion, but from anticipation. "I found you," he barked. Short, sharp, a call. Victor turned. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. And then nothing. No recognition, no surprise, no relief. Victor's gaze swept over him with the same disinterest he might give a passing shadow. His face remained unreadable, his movements uninterrupted as he stepped into the warm glow of the hotel. Maximus barked again, louder this time. A plea, a desperate command for the man who had once been his world to see him. Victor didn't look back. The glass doors slid shut, separating them with cold indifference. Maximus stood motionless, the rain drumming against his back. For a long time he did not move, because the truth had finally settled inside him heavy, suffocating. Victor hadn't forgotten him. Victor had abandoned him. The last piece of certainty in Maximus's world shattered. For the first time in his life, he had no purpose, no master, no home. His legs, which had carried him so far, so desperately, suddenly refused to move. He sank onto the wet pavement, his head lowering toward the ground. He did not know what to do. He did not know who he was without Victor. The city moved on around him, uncaring, unstoppable. People rushed past, cars honked. The glow of advertisements flickered against the dark. Maximus lay there, surrounded by life yet entirely alone. And for the first time he stopped waiting. For the first time, he stopped believing he would ever be found. The rain didn't stop. It soaked through Maximus's thick coat, turning the golden fur dark, making him shiver beneath its weight. The city pulsed around him, a living thing that never slept, but he remained still, lying on the cold pavement outside the hotel where Victor had vanished. He had lost. There was no command to follow, no voice calling him back. His entire life had been built around service, around obedience, around belonging, but now he belonged nowhere. For a long time he didn't move. And then something shifted. A shadow stretched across the wet pavement beside him, followed by the shuffle of hesitant footsteps. A scent not Victor's, but human, warm, layered with sweat and old fabric. A voice followed, rough but kind. "Well, ain't this a sight?" Maximus didn't lift his head. He barely had the strength to acknowledge the stranger. "You just gonna lie there all night, boy?" The voice was closer now. "City ain't kind to lost souls. Believe me, I know." A pause. Then the scrape of fabric, the shifting of weight. The man sat beside him, not close enough to touch, but near enough that Maximus could feel the warmth of his presence against the cold. For a moment, neither moved. Then Maximus lifted his head just slightly. The man was older, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, his beard thick with graying strands. His face was lined with the kind of wear that came from years of being unseen, a ghost among the crowds. He met Maximus's eyes and smiled faintly. "Figured as much," he murmured. "You got that same look, that waitin' for something that ain't comin' kind of look." Maximus just stared. The man sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Yeah, been there too, buddy." The rain softened to a drizzle, misting against the city lights. The man reached into the folds of his coat, pulling out a crumpled sandwich wrapped in paper. "Ain't much, but if you're hungry—" He tore off a piece, setting it on the ground between them. No pressure. Maximus hesitated. The memory of Victor's estate flickered in his mind bowls filled with expensive cuts of meat, the finest food money could buy. This was different. This was simple, rough, offered without expectation. Slowly, he reached forward and took it. The man let out a quiet chuckle. There you go. Silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way Maximus didn't understand. You got a name? The man asked. He glanced at the wet collar around Maximus's neck, where Victor Langley's name gleamed in gold. Huh, bet you was something fancy once. That collar probably worth more than my whole damn life. He shook his head, smiling without bitterness. Well, fancy boy, looks like we're both not where we're supposed to be, huh? Maximus swallowed the last bit of food and finally lifted his head fully. Something stirred in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close. The city never stopped, but somehow, here beneath the bridge, time seemed slower. The man, his name was Henry, didn't speak much after that first night. He simply was. Maximus followed. Not because he was commanded, but because he had nothing left to follow. Days passed. The rain lifted. The cold remained. Henry walked the streets like a man who had made peace with being unseen. He spoke to the world in nods and gestures, slipping through alleyways and back streets, avoiding the parts of the city where people mattered. And Maximus learned. He learned the places where food could be found, not the kind in crystal bowls, but in discarded bags behind restaurants, in the hands of kind strangers who gave without question. He learned which streets were safe, which corners were claimed by men with sharp eyes and sharper hunger. He learned how to survive. It was different from the life he had known. Victor had once taught him discipline, obedience, the strict order of a world where power meant everything. But Henry's world was different. Here, it wasn't about following orders. It was about watching, listening, knowing when to move and when to be still. Maximus had always been strong, but now he became something more. Smart, silent, a shadow that learned the rhythm of the city. And then, one night, it happened. A scream, short, sharp, a call. Maximus's ears pricked forward. Henry, who had been sifting through a pile of discarded coats near an alleyway, tensed. That ain't good. Another scream, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle. A woman's voice. Maximus didn't hesitate. He ran. The alley was dark, swallowed by shadows. A young woman, barely more than a girl was, backed against a damp brick wall, her hands shaking as she tried to push away a man twice her size. His grip was tight on her arm, his voice low and dangerous. Maximus didn't think. He moved. A deep growl ripped through his chest as he lunged, his teeth flashing in the dim light. He didn't aim to kill, just to end it. The man barely had time to react before Maximus knocked into him, sending him stumbling backward. The woman gasped, her breath hitching as she scrambled free. The man cursed, regaining his footing, his eyes flashing with anger. Maximus stood firm, his body low, teeth bared. The man hesitated, and then he ran. The woman sagged against the wall, breathless, hands trembling. Maximus stayed still, watching her, waiting. And then she laughed. Soft, disbelieving. "You're not just any stray, are you?" she murmured. Maximus only blinked. She crouched slightly, reaching out, her fingers hesitant as they hovered near his fur. "I don't know if you can understand me, but thank you." A pause. And then a whisper of warmth against his cold fur. A touch. Not an order, not a command. Just kindness. Maximus did not flinch away. And for the first time since he had been left behind, he did not feel abandoned. The woman's hand was warm against Maximus's damp fur, her touch hesitant but genuine. He did not pull away, he did not flinch. For so long, his world had been dictated by orders, by the certainty of knowing where he belonged and who he served. But this was different. This was a choice. She exhaled shakily, still catching her breath. The city roared around them, but here in the quiet alleyway, it felt like time had slowed. "You really saved me," she murmured. "I don't even know how to thank you." Maximus simply watched her, his golden brown eyes steady. She smiled, then small, tired but real. "You need a name." Her gaze flickered to the collar still fastened around his neck, Victor Langley's name gleaming in gold. The sight of it made something dark flash through her expression. "Whoever left you doesn't deserve you." She reached forward, her fingers brushing the clasp of the collar. For a moment, Maximus stiffened. He had worn it for so long. It had been a part of him, a symbol of who he was, what he was. but he was no longer that dog. He did not belong to Victor anymore. Slowly, he lowered his head, allowing her to undo the clasp. The collar fell to the ground with a dull, metallic clink. She picked it up, running her thumb over the engraved nameplate before setting it aside. "There," she whispered. "Now you're just you." Maximus let out a slow breath, and for the first time he felt free. They walked together. The city was the same, loud and unrelenting, but it no longer felt quite so empty. The woman, her name was Elena, kept glancing at him, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. "You really don't have anywhere to go, do you?" she mused. Maximus didn't answer, but the truth was clear. She bit her lip, thinking. I don't have much, but I can't just leave you out here." She hesitated. "I live in a tiny apartment, barely big enough for me, but—" She trailed off, studying him. Then, with a small nod, she smiled. "Let's get you home." Home. The word sat heavy in Maximus' chest. Not a mansion, not luxury, not Victor. Something else. Something new. He followed. Not because he was ordered, but because he chose to. Elena's apartment was small but warm. The scent of old books and lavender filled the air, a soft contrast to the sterile, expensive places Maximus had once known. She rummaged through her kitchen, pulling out a can of tuna. "It's not much, but I hope it'll do." She set the dish down. Maximus hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, eating. She sat on the floor, watching him with quiet curiosity. "You're not just some stray, are you?" she murmured. "You were trained. You belong to someone." Maximus lifted his gaze to hers. "I know what that's like," she admitted, pulling her knees to her chest. "Being abandoned." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. They understood each other in a way words couldn't express. For the first time in weeks, Maximus curled up somewhere safe. For the first time, he slept without waiting for someone who would never return. Days turned into weeks. Elena never tried to claim him. She never put a collar back around his neck, never ordered him to stay. But he did, because he wanted to. She would talk to him sometimes, filling the silence with words, never expecting a response but speaking as though he understood. And in a way, he did. She worked long hours at a small bookstore, leaving early and returning late. She never had much, but she always brought home something for him. "I saw a German shepherd on television today," she told him one evening. "They said they're loyal to a fault." She smiled at him. "Sounds about right." Maximus only wagged his tail. She laughed, shaking her head. "You need a name." She thought for a moment, then grinned. "How about Phoenix?" Maximus tilted his head. "You know, like the bird that rises from the ashes? You had one life before, and now you're starting over." He considered it. Phoenix. A name that wasn't tied to him, to Victor, to the past. A name that was new. He stepped forward and rested his head against her knee. Her smile softened. "Phoenix it is." Months passed. The city changed with the seasons, but their little apartment remained constant. It wasn't grand, it wasn't luxury, but it was home. Phoenix was no longer the dog waiting outside an airport. He no longer searched for someone who had left him behind. He had found something better. He had found family. And this time, it was forever. Maximus was left behind, abandoned by the man he once trusted, but in the darkest moments he found something more valuable than wealth, a new beginning. Life doesn't always go as planned, but sometimes, what seems like the end is just a new path waiting to be taken. Have you ever felt lost, only to find something unexpected? Have you ever started over, stronger than before? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us we are never truly alone.